Welcome back to Ignite the Fire, where we dive into messages from Flame Community Church. We're excited to have a new voice with us today. John, our minister in training, has been sharing some incredible insights from his recent sermon series, Heroes of the Faith.
It's been an honor to explore these stories and unpack what they mean for us today.
This deep dive focuses on two figures who really embody that faith in action idea. Nehemiah, from the Old Testament, and George Müller, a 19th century Christian philanthropist. It's fascinating how these figures, separated by centuries, offer such timeless lessons.
Absolutely. And that's what makes their stories so relevant. They demonstrate that the challenges of faith, leadership, and service are universal, regardless of time or context.
Let's start with Nehemiah. You took us back to a pretty crucial point in Jewish history in your sermon. The Jewish people had returned to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile and had rebuilt the temple. Yet the city walls remained in ruins, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. What struck you about this setting as you prepared your message?
It really hit me how that physical vulnerability mirrored a deeper spiritual vulnerability.
Hmm.
Without those walls, they lacked not just physical security, but a sense of wholeness and identity. It's like trying to rebuild a life with a gaping hole in its foundation.
That's a powerful image. And that's where Nehemiah comes in, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't just some random guy who happened to be good at construction. He was serving in the Persian king's court, a position of authority and trust.
Exactly. He was the king's cupbearer, which meant he was responsible for ensuring the king's safety, literally tasting his drinks to check for poison.
Talk about high pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So here's Nehemiah living a comfortable life in the palace, and he gets word that Jerusalem, his ancestral home, is essentially defenseless. How does he react?
He's devastated. We see in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 1, verse 4, that he weeps and mourns for days. He's gripped by this profound sadness and a sense of responsibility to do something. John described it as a holy dissatisfaction, which really resonated with me.
This idea of holy dissatisfaction is intriguing. I think a lot of us can relate to feeling dissatisfied with the state of things, whether in our personal lives, our communities, or the world at large. But how do we know if it's a holy dissatisfaction? Something we should act upon?
That's a great question. I think the key difference lies in the source and the outcome. Nehemiah's dissatisfaction wasn't rooted in personal ambition or frustration. It stemmed from his deep love for his people and ultimately for God. And it propelled him toward positive action, seeking God's will and working to bring about restoration.
So it's not just about complaining or feeling overwhelmed by the problems. It's about channeling that energy into something productive, something aligned with God's purpose.
Precisely. And we see that so clearly in Nehemiah's approach. He doesn't just rush back to Jerusalem and start throwing bricks around. He spends time in prayer, seeking God's guidance and wisdom. He plans meticulously, considering the resources he'll need, the potential opposition he might face, and how to organize the community for such a massive undertaking.
So it's a combination of passion and planning, of seeking God's will and taking practical steps to fulfill it. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty, but he's also not acting impulsively.
Exactly. And I think that's an important lesson for us today. It's tempting to jump into action when we see a need, but sometimes the most effective approach is to pause, pray, and plan strategically. We need to seek God's wisdom and direction before diving in head first.
Okay, so Nehemiah has prayed. He's planned. He's gotten permission from the king to go back to Jerusalem. He arrives, assesses the damage, and starts rallying the people. How does he motivate them to join this seemingly impossible task of rebuilding the wall?
He appeals to their shared heritage, their longing for security, and their desire to restore Jerusalem to its former glory. He reminds them that this isn't just about building a physical structure, it's about rebuilding their lives, their community, their identity as God's chosen people.
It's not just a construction project, it's a spiritual revival.
Yeah.
He's essentially saying, we're not just laying bricks, we're laying the foundation for a renewed future.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how people respond. They catch his vision and commit themselves to the work, despite the enormous challenges.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, right?
Yeah.
John emphasized the opposition they faced, both from within and outside the community.
There was mockery, sabotage, even threats of violence. Some people thought the task was too daunting, while others actively tried to undermine their efforts. It's a reminder that any time we step out in faith to make a difference, we're likely to encounter resistance.
So how did Nehemiah deal with these challenges? How did he keep the people motivated and focused amidst such adversity?
He was a master at addressing both the practical and the spiritual dimensions of the problem. He organized the people into work crews and defense units, ensuring that they were equipped to handle both the construction and the potential threats. He also reminded them constantly of God's presence and purpose, encouraging them to persevere in the face of opposition.
So he was both a strategic leader and a spiritual encourager, understanding that both were essential to achieve their goal. I'm struck by the image of them rebuilding the wall with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, literally defending their work as they went.
It speaks to the level of commitment and resilience required to overcome obstacles and achieve something meaningful. They knew that rebuilding the wall wasn't just about physical security, it was about claiming their identity, reclaiming their heritage, and restoring their relationship with God. It was a fight worth fighting for.
And fight they did. In Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 15, we read that they completed the entire wall in just 52 days. It's an incredible feat of human determination and, I would argue, divine intervention.
Absolutely. It's a testament to what can be accomplished when people unite around a common purpose, fueled by faith, courage, and a relentless spirit.
Okay, so we've seen how Nehemiah's story is about so much more than just bricks and mortar. It's a powerful example of leadership, resilience, and the importance of aligning our actions with God's purpose.
It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, God can work through us to accomplish extraordinary things.
But what about George Müller? How does his story connect to this idea of holy dissatisfaction and taking action? That's what we'll pick up after a quick break. All right, let's shift gears now and talk about George Müller, a man whose life is a testament to the power of faith and action. In your sermon, you started by talking about Miller's rather unconventional path to ministry. He didn't exactly have a saintly youth, did he?
Not quite. He was actually quite a rebellious young man. In his autobiography, he recounts his early years filled with petty theft and even a stint in prison. It's a reminder that God's grace can reach even the most unlikely candidates.
It's a pretty dramatic transformation from a troubled youth to a renowned Christian philanthropist. What was a turning point for him?
It was during his university years that Müller had a profound encounter with God. Through the influence of a friend and the power of prayer, he experienced a radical conversion, dedicating his life to serving God. This led him to missionary work and eventually to the calling that would define his legacy, caring for orphans.
You mentioned that Müller was deeply moved by the plight of orphans in Bristol, England, and was dissatisfied with the existing solutions. What was it about this situation that sparked this holy dissatisfaction in him?
He saw firsthand the deplorable conditions in many orphanages, where children were often neglected and mistreated. He felt a deep conviction that every child deserved love, care, and a chance to thrive. This wasn't just a social issue for Müller, it was a spiritual imperative.
So instead of trying to reform the existing system or work within the established structures, he decided to create something entirely new.
Yes, he felt called to establish orphanages that would be run on Christian principles, providing not only physical necessities, but also spiritual and emotional nourishment. But here's the thing. He resolved to do it without relying on traditional fundraising methods.
Okay, now that's where things get really interesting. He didn't solicit donations, hold fundraising galas, or seek government funding. How did he plan to support these orphanages?
Through prayer, and prayer alone. Müller believed that if he faithfully sought God's provision, God would meet the needs of the children. It was a radical act of faith, putting complete trust in God's faithfulness.
I have to admit that level of trust is a bit mind-boggling to me. To depend entirely on unsolicited donations to feed, clothe, and house hundreds of children. Did he ever waver in his conviction? Did he ever doubt that God would come through?
There were certainly times of testing, moments when resources were scarce and the future seemed uncertain. But Müller's journals are filled with accounts of how God miraculously provided for the needs of the orphanages time and time again.
In your sermon, you shared some pretty amazing anecdotes from Müller's life that illustrate this unwavering faith. Could you share one with us now?
Of course. One particularly striking story involves the delivery of milk. One morning, the children were sitting down for breakfast, but there was no milk. Müller, unfazed, gathered the children to pray, asking God to provide. Just as they finished praying, a milkman arrived at the orphanage door. His cart had broken down right outside, and he had milk that was about to spoil. He offered it to Müller, and it was exactly the amount the children needed.
Wow, that's either incredible timing or a powerful testament to the efficacy of prayer. I'm leaning towards the latter.
It's hard to deny the sense of divine intervention in stories like that, and there are countless others. Miller would often pray for specific needs, from food and clothing to funds for building expansion, and time and again, those needs would be met in unexpected and often extraordinary ways.
It's one thing to pray for a parking spot, but to entrust the well-being of hundreds of children entirely to God's provision. That takes a level of faith that most of us can only aspire to, but it also raises some important questions. Some might argue that relying solely on prayer is irresponsible, even reckless, especially when it comes to the welfare of vulnerable children. How would you address that concern?
That's a valid point, and it's a tension that many people grapple with when considering Miller's story. Um, it's important to note that Miller wasn't advocating for a passive approach to life or suggesting that we simply sit back and wait for miracles to happen. He firmly believed that faith must be accompanied by action.
So it wasn't just about praying and hoping for the best. What did that action look like for her?
He was incredibly diligent in running the orphanages, ensuring that everything was done with excellence and integrity. He meticulously kept records of all donations and expenses, demonstrating transparency and accountability. He also worked tirelessly to train the children, equipping them with skills and values that would enable them to thrive as adults.
So it was a balanced approach, combining fervent prayer with practical wisdom and responsible stewardship.
Exactly. And I think it's crucial to recognize that Mueller wasn't trying to prescribe a formula for everyone. He was sharing his own personal journey of faith, demonstrating what was possible when we fully surrender our lives to God's guidance and provision.
You also mentioned in your sermon that Mueller was a man of great integrity, even when it came to financial matters. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. One story that highlights his principled stand involved a large sum of money offered by someone he knew was in debt. Mueller refused the donation, explaining that he couldn't accept funds that rightfully belonged to others.
Wow, that's a powerful example of putting principles above pragmatism. He wasn't willing to compromise his ethical standards, even when it meant potentially jeopardizing the financial security of the orphanages.
It speaks volumes about his character and his unwavering commitment to doing things the right way. He believed that God would honor his integrity, and as history shows, God did. By the time Miller died, he had cared for over 10,000 children, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us today.
So we have Nehemiah, the strategic leader who rebuilt the city wall, and George Müller, the prayer warrior who built an empire of orphanages. Two very different men, yet both driven by this profound, holy dissatisfaction. What's the common thread here? What can we, as everyday people, learn from their extraordinary lives?
I think what's striking me is that both Nehemiah and George Müller exemplify the idea that faith isn't passive. It's not about sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. They saw a need, they sought God's guidance, and then they took action, stepping out in faith even when the odds seemed stacked against them. Yeah, and they understood that their actions were a direct response to their faith. They weren't just trying to be good people or make a difference in the world. They were driven by a deep conviction that God had called them to these specific tasks and that he would empower them to fulfill those callings.
So it's about aligning our actions with God's purpose, not just pursuing our own agendas or trying to solve problems in our own strength.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of holy dissatisfaction comes in again. It's not just about being unhappy with the status quo, it's about discerning God's heart for a situation and allowing that dissatisfaction to fuel our actions to propel us towards positive change.
In his sermon, John challenged the congregation with a question that I think is relevant for us here. He asked, "What are you dissatisfied with?" It's a question that forces us to look inward and examine our own hearts. What are the things in our lives, in our communities, in the world around us that make us say, this isn't right, something needs to change?
Right. It's a powerful question and one that can be a bit unsettling. It requires honesty, self-reflection, and a willingness to confront our own complacency.
You know, I've been thinking about this idea of holy dissatisfaction as we've been talking, and I'm wondering, how do we ensure that it leads to constructive action rather than just frustration or despair? It's easy to get overwhelmed by the problems we see in the world, but how do we channel that energy into something positive, something that actually makes a difference?
That's such an important point. I think the key is to remember that we're not meant to do it alone. We have God's guidance, his power, and his resources available to us. Just like Nehemiah and George Müller, we need to ground our dissatisfaction in prayer, seeking God's wisdom and direction.
So it's not about trying to be a superhero and fix everything ourselves. It's about recognizing our need for God, partnering with him, and trusting that he will work through us even in small, seemingly insignificant ways.
Exactly, and that's where the real beauty of this concept lies. It's not about the scale of our actions or the grandeur of our achievements. It's about being faithful in the small things, in the everyday moments where we have the opportunity to reflect God's love, His justice, and His compassion.
So it could be something as simple as offering a kind word to someone who's struggling, volunteering our time at a local charity, or even just praying for those who are hurting.
Precisely. It's about being attentive to the needs around us and responding in ways that are aligned with God's heart. And the amazing thing is that even the smallest acts of kindness, when done with a sincere heart and a desire to honor God, can have a ripple effect, creating positive change far beyond what we could ever imagine.
Well, a huge thank you to John for sharing his insights with us today. Nehemiah and George Müller are truly inspiring examples of what's possible when we combine faith with action.
Their stories remind us that with God, all things are possible.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to check out Flame Community Church's Facebook, YouTube, or website to watch John's full sermons. There's so much more to explore and be inspired by.
God bless. See you next week.